right, well, it's noon, everyone, and I only see a few more people rolling in to join the webinar. So we're gonna kick it off now.
All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Today, the topic of our webinar is root rots, and myself, Dr. Siobhan Dayball, and my colleague, Dr. Sarah Jandrusik, are co-hosting this webinar with our colleague, Dr. Jeremy Jubenville from Michigan State University. And he will introduce our speaker, Dr. Maury Hausbeck, very shortly. But first, I just wanted to give you an overview into our webinar series. As you may have noticed or seen, we've rebranded ourselves to something a little bit more catchy. So we're calling our new webinar series GrowON. It's a little bit of a play on Ontario. And we have speakers from across the world in North America talking about their expertise in greenhouse production, controlled environment systems, IPM, and ornamentals, which might be of interest to this group. So the webinars can be co-hosted by any 4 of the greenhouse specialists with OMAFRA, and you could see all 4 of us on the screen. Again, that's myself and Sarah, as well as our colleagues in vegetables, Fatty and Kara. And Kara is returning from mat leave next week. We are very happy that she will be joining us again. But again, topics might include things like robotics and sensors, IPM concerns, especially things that are concerning right now, and plant production and protection topics. So we're very pleased to bring this webinar series to you. We hope that you'll continue to join us on a monthly or regular basis as the webinars roll out. You can always catch the updates on our blog on floriculture.com. So with that, I'll leave it to Jeremy to introduce our speaker for today.
All right, thanks, Siobhan. Hello, everyone. I want to thank Sarah and Siobhan for graciously allowing us to share the airwaves this afternoon. As Siobhan mentioned, my name is Jeremy, and I am a greenhouse agent with Michigan State University Extension. In my role, I work primarily with commercial flower growers across 7 counties in Southwest Michigan. Before we start, I want to bring your attention to the Q&A button, which is located or should be located at the bottom of your Zoom window. So please feel free to submit questions at any point during the presentation. We will be keeping track of them, and I'll be sure to give our guest a chance to answer them at the end of the presentation. So we have a great group of people on the ornamental horticulture team, and it is truly my pleasure to introduce our guest this morning. Maury Hausbeck is an MSU Distinguished Professor and Extension Specialist in plant pathology. She supports both the vegetable and ornamental industries, which means that she supports the majority of herbaceous specialty crops here in Michigan. I can say that there are a whole bunch of extension agents here, including myself, that look to her for answers to all kinds of questions regarding plant diseases and how to help growers manage them. And we are very happy to have her here with us today. Maury, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, and thanks, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. And I'm going to go ahead and get this kicked off. In working through this the other day, I noticed that I have a pretty ambitious set of topics to cover. I'm always trying to squeeze more in than maybe I should. So without further ado, I'm going to get this rolling. And I am, let's see. It's in presentation, not in presentation mode. All right, where's my little icon to get it in presentation mode?
If you go up to the top to slideshow as well, you can get it to it there.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Yeah, mine disappears too every once in a while. So
yeah, it disappears.
And then just from the beginning, should click that and you should be good to go.
Yeah. Oh, that's a handy trick. I've always looked for it on the bottom, and then when it disappears, it's kind of confusing.
Looks great, Maury.
Okay. All righty. So I want to acknowledge Blair Harlan, who's my technician on the greenhouse side of my program. He's been in my program for more than 20 years. And so he couldn't be here today. So I'm going to do my best to cover the information, much of which he generated through various trials. All right, so we're going to cover Thielaviopsis, Rhizoctonia, Phytophthora, Pythium, and I have a few slides of Fusarium. So Thielaviopsis black root rot is one that is a very difficult pathogen to manage. It does have a preference for specific crops. Pansy, vinca, and petunia are among those crops that we see this problem quite commonly. However, it's not the only group of crops that can suffer from black root rot. I think what is most challenging for growers is that the symptoms of this particular root rot can mimic nutritional deficiencies. And so sometimes growers may get some materials in, maybe they're plug plants, maybe they're pre-finished materials, and they look a little chlorotic, a little yellowed, and the grower, being ever optimistic, says, with a little bit of nutrition here, I'm sure I can bring these plants right around. And sometimes that fertilization program does improve things on the short end, but then, or in the short term rather, but then the plants begin to decline again. And so plant stunting, and of course, plant death is quite common here. We have seen, unfortunately, some of this pathogen be moved around through plugs and other plant materials. And so it's really important to buy from a reputable source. This particular pathogen is very difficult to manage once it's been introduced into your greenhouse. We see this pathogen come back to haunt growers year after year. And in part, that's because this pathogen survives very readily. And so some of the growing mats, some of the other materials that growers might routinely sanitize and feel like that's adequate can actually continue to harbor this pathogen despite the grower's best efforts. pH can be a bit of an issue, although I don't think that's as limiting a factor. And then effective fungicides really are what's needed here in order to work through this problem. The Thielaviopsis black root rot is one root rot pathogen that sometimes, and maybe even oftentimes, can be diagnosed upon examination of the lower stem or root sections under a microscope. And that's because this pathogen will show these dark barrel-like structures. I always think of them as these kind of old-time hard candies, the root beer barrels. And to me, this is what I always think about, is that these dark pathogens that form right on the stem and the roots, it gives the root a blackened appearance, which sometimes can be observed with maybe a 10x lens, but oftentimes a diagnostic clinic does not have to culture these roots to get you a good understanding of the problem that's impacting your crop. And so that allows one to move forward pretty rapidly to remediate the issue. This is an example of some samples that came in. And you will see that, these came to a producer as plugs. And on the right-hand side of that inset, you'll see some roots that are not as well formed as those on the left. And the black root rot is the reason why that plant is stunted. It's not thriving, even though it has a fair amount of roots. They're not what they should be. And so with this particular pathogen, despite growers' best efforts, and I would say really in many cases, I've seen growers go to extensive efforts to sanitize. However, this pathogen, those brown pigmented root beer barrel-like candy spores are very well adapted to survive for a long time. And so if there's an outbreak in a greenhouse, I really advise that the grower not reuse pots, flats, plug trays, and not reuse a growing mat that would have come in contact with this disease crop. Trying trying to clean those materials is just more of a challenge than what I think can occur. And then oftentimes we see a problem in the subsequent years. Fungus gnats and shore flies are known for carrying a number of soil-borne pathogens around the greenhouse, and Thielaviopsis is no exception. And while I did highlight the most commonly infected crops, Thielaviopsis also infects geraniums, poinsettias, and also vegetable transplants. All right, once this problem is introduced, if you have a crop that's infected, it's been diagnosed, if you're going to try to salvage that crop, we have done so many trials that the thiophanate methyl active ingredient in the US, we have this as 3336. It's an old time product. Our EPA does not love this product. It's still registered for ornamental crops. And you'll see that there's quite a big difference where we left plants untreated with this product versus those plants that were treated in a timely way with thiophanate methyl. We've looked at some of the newer actives that are available. And, I have spoken to Ontario groups a couple times this year on the vegetable side. And, of course, even though you are our neighbors and pretty close neighbors at that, we are different countries, and therefore our registrations for pesticides are not comparable. And so, again, what I have tested and what I recommend in this study, in all likelihood will not translate well to what you have available. And so I always offer that disclaimer. But hopefully some of the actives that we do talk about that are effective will be available to you as well. So we do look at some of the new actives. We've not seen good efficacy over the years to try to clarify what have been better players, if you will, in our fungicide trials. I have gone to an A team, B team sort of approach. And this harkens back to the days when my kids were in sports and I was sitting in the stands a lot, sometimes trying to work, and then recognizing that although my kids were always B team players, they were really good bench warmers, that they still had a role, but they were never the A team. And as a parent, I really did not want them leading off the game or coming into a game when a lot of help was needed. And so this system has kind of stuck. And so the A team, we have Cleary's thiophanate methyl. That is probably my top choice because we see that it works very well. The medallion, that's fludeoxonil. We can see some growth regulatory effects with this product. Sometimes growers want that. And so just be mindful of that. And then TerraGuard. These are different FRAC groups, and the FRAC group is designated by the parentheses after the active ingredient, which means that each of these fungicides has a different mode of action, and that's desirable. In this particular situation, if you have an infestation of this pathogen, you do need to use the high labeled rates that could make the medallion and TerraGuard a bit expensive. And again, high labeled rates, short application intervals. Even then, those plants that you are able to turn around likely will not be of the size that they should be had they been healthy. And that just, again, speaks to this really difficult pathogen. All right. And then throughout the talk, I have various slides such as this that apply to really everything we're talking about. And so here's one which applies to all of the pathogens, which is timing is everything. When you're trying to combat a problem using a fungicide, stretching the application interval often opens up a window of opportunity for that pathogen to reinfect and reestablish itself. Remember that these fungicide drenches, and for the root rots, we are applying drenches, that they really do not outright kill the pathogen so much as they suppress and create a safe zone for that root system to grow into. And so when the application interval is stretched and that active ingredient is no longer able to protect the root or create the safe space, and that pathogen will re-invade that space and cause more infections. Always use a full labeled rate, do not cut rates. Alternate fungicides so the active ingredients, the frat codes differ, and then never rely on one fungicide in your treatment program. Sometimes people say, well, you know, the labeled rate is this amount, and so I really don't need 100% control, so I won't use the full label rate. Really, 75% control is really just fine because I don't have a lot of pressure. Therefore, I'll use 75% of the rate. And so while that may make sense to an individual that doesn't, you know, work in these studies, what really happens if you use something less than the full labeled rate, you're likely to get 0% control. And so you have to use the minimum full labeled rate in order to have any hope of managing pathogens. All right, sanitation is really important. And while this is important for Thielaviopsis, it's also important for all of the pathogens that we'll talk about. Use clean containers, do not reuse pots from diseased plants, use new growing mats, keep walkways, benches, and equipment clean. There's a really great study from the 1970s that I talk about. I don't know who was a student that did it, but they collected the sweepings from the greenhouse, and they isolated a whole host of pathogens from that dust from the greenhouse floor. Sanitize, and again, while I'm introducing it under Thielaviopsis, this information is important for everything that we're going to talk about today. So chlorine bleach can be used. It's a 10% solution. We talk about a 30-minute soak. We're not talking about a quick dip. Prepare solutions fresh before use to ensure that you have the effective oxidizing power. Because what will happen is if like a dirty stack of trays is placed into a chlorine bleach solution, that the oxidizing power, that agent is going to be tied up by all the organic material on those trays, and it's not going to be available to affect the pathogen. Replenish the solution after 2 hours. And I always say, make sure that the objects that you want to sanitize are clean to the eye before soaking. And so that means that you do a power wash or some kind of washing step before sanitizing. There are other disinfectants, hydrogen dioxide. In our part of the world, xylitol can be used for this purpose. There is some research that was done. Again, it was very tedious research, similar to what I talked about with sweeping the walkways and seeing what pathogens are there. People actually use tweezers to remove root segments from sanitized trays and then plated those out to see the pathogens that remained. And they showed that the high rate of a product such as hydrogen dioxide is needed. And again, the more organic material that is on those trays and pots being sanitized, the faster that the oxidizing agent is exhausted and won't be available to do its job on the pathogen. The quaternary ammonia products tend to be more stable. You still need a 20-minute soak. You need fresh solutions, but you don't need them as frequently as you do for the bleach. And so that can be maybe a better option for some. All right, so let's move on to Rhizoctonia Root Rot. I don't run into Rhizoctonia as much as I do some of the other pathogens, but it's definitely worth covering. Rhizoctonia has mycelial or thread-like segments, which are pictured on the left. It doesn't have like a spore per se, but those mycelial fragments that reside in contaminated soil or diseased plants survives very well. It survives just as well as spores. What's interesting about Rhizoctonia root rot is you often see some of the blighting, if you will, either at or just above the soil line. And you have a couple of examples of each here where that constriction is right at the soil line. It's hard to see in this picture. And then for the plant to the left of it, the constriction is above the soil line. And so you tend to get those kinds of symptoms for Rhizoctonia. All right, this is a true fungi. It's a little bit different than the Pythiums and Phytophthora that we talk about, and it can cause a number of symptoms. It doesn't produce spores, but the pieces of mycelium can be in the soil, and anything that spreads soil would spread Rhizoctonia. I think we have a number of really excellent products that can be used against Rhizoctonia. This Affirm, it's not a, it could come under the biorational category. It may, in the US, the organic certifiers won't certify it as organic, but it is an interesting product. And then we have some of the other products. The active ingredients are in the parentheses, and then the FRAC codes at the very end. Terrachlor is a really, really old product. It can be helpful. I do think you can get a little bit of root pruning on seedlings, so I'm always a little bit cautious about that. And we have different FRAC groups that can be used. We even have some reasonable B team materials. You could see, for instance, a thiophanate methyl, if that's registered in your country, that if you're not certain if it's Rhizoctonia or Thielaviopsis, because vinca, for instance, can have Rhizoctonia problems, it can have Thielaviopsis problems, you could use Clearies and kind of target both. All right, so for soil-borne diseases, cultural control, again, this is something that is pertinent to everything we're talking about. Avoid plant stress, high salts, excessive moisture, excessive dryness. I will say that one of the root rot situations that I still recall is a grower's attempt to rectify a Pythium situation on poinsettias where losses were up into the $100,000, and the fungicides were not working. Well, nothing worked really until his high salts were brought down. And once the high salts were brought down, then he had success with the control program, but there were a lot of losses prior to us understanding that the salts were so high in his poinsettia that nothing we were attempting was offering him any relief. All right, there are some biological controls, and for Rhizoctonia, I think that's a really good opportunity because it doesn't have spores. It's not going to reproduce as rapidly as something like Phytophthora that has a swimming spore. Rhizoctonia is going to move more slowly. It's not going to ramp up as quickly, and therefore I think it's a really good opportunity for biological control. And again, these sorts of elements apply to any biological control that you might want to apply for any of the soil-borne pathogens we're talking about. Should be applied preventively. None of these biologicals, it's really not fair to think of them as a curative product and you apply them once you see problems. I think it's just not fair to the product, and it's certainly not fair to your situation because it's not going to work well. And then I often think about combining approaches, biological plus conventional. Not all of our fungicides would damage a biological control. There could be some circumstances where that would be the case, but I don't think you have to choose a biological control program only or a conventional control program only. I think you can have a hybrid if you're interested. All right, let's move on to Phytophthora Root Rot. When we see this, it's really often a disaster. We see it on Calibrachoa, see it on Snapdragon, we see it on English ivy. It moves quickly. It's often misdiagnosed as Pythium. The Pythium controlling products don't work well enough to stem the tide of epidemic that we can see with this particular pathogen. This is a water mold, so the Pythium and Phytophthora that we'll speak about are cousins. They're related. Phytophthora produces a swimming spore. That means with free water, soil saturation, this pathogen will kick into overdrive, and there will be so many propagules that are available to cause infections on both the currently diseased plant and adjacent plants that there can be losses that happen quite rapidly. This is just a pictorial that shows that lemon-shaped spore. It's a sporangium, and that's bad enough, right? You know, one sporangium equals one infection. However, under saturated conditions, under really wet conditions, when the soil pores are filled with water, what will happen is within each sporangium will form 20 to 40 kidney-shaped zoospores that then are released through this pore that's shown. And then you'll see those kidney-shaped spores have various flagella, and that's how they move in water. And so one sporangium equals one infection now goes from one sporangium equals 20 to 40 zoospores equals 20 to 40 in plant infections. And so things can get out of hand really, really quickly. And then the zoospores work really, really fast. And so they actually key in on some of the exudates from a host root that basically is sending a note that it's time for dinner. And the zoospores will then swim to that root that has exuded that very savory signal, and then really have an infection that is very hard then to pull back. Right, here's some examples of some of the fungicides that we have trialed over the years. You know, compared to previous days, we really have a number of new Phytophthora materials, which gives us more choices. You'll see the untreated where we did nothing. We had about 75% plant death. You know, we run our trials fairly aggressively. You know, there are a couple schools of thought there that in my role in making recommendations, I cannot know the particular disease pressure that a grower is experiencing. Will they have 3% loss? Will they have 25% loss if something isn't done? Will it be more? And so the way that I look at it, if I know that my recommendations will hold under really heavy disease pressure, I feel confident that that grower can turn the situation around and not be devastated economically. So we have a number of materials that are really quite effective against the Phytophtheras. Most of these products have moved into the ornamental realm from the vegetable realm. And so there's a good body of evidence that indicates their ability to control Phytophtheras. Subdue Max, the methanoxam metalaxyl, has been a long-term standard. And then some of the newer products I think can be helpful. They may not have as good of soil activity as maybe Subdue and Adorn, but they're really good products and can be used in alternation as needed. Again, here's some examples. Segovis is probably one of the latest highly effective materials to come into the Phytophthora game plan. So I'm happy to have it. So here's our A team. I think it's really quite a stellar A team. We have really good players here that have been documented to be highly effective on the vegetable side, where those vegetables get Phytophtheras as root and crown rots, and they've moved over really nicely to the ornamental side. We have different frat codes that are available to give us good different modes of action. That's really important because Phytophthora would love nothing more than to develop resistance to methanoxam. It's done it in other systems. It's really good at it. So let's not have that happen and use alternating materials. We have a few B team materials, and that's in part, you know, Segway, Stature, tend to be more foliar applied materials. And so I think their soil activity just isn't as strong, but they're reasonable products to put into a program, especially preventively. All right, let's move on to Pythium. It was interesting because I was just in a student exam before this, and the topic was Pythium on potato. And it was interesting to think about how long Pythium has been a problem on ornamentals and how it continues to be such a problem. For root rot pathogens, it probably affects more crops than any other. We still don't have really fabulous materials. The newer actives that have come on the market have targeted Phytophthora. We're happy to have them, but we don't have new highly effective, well, let me say this differently. We don't have as many new active ingredients that are highly effective for Pythium as we do for Phytophthora. And so there are different Pythiums that we see in ornamentals, and those can vary among between greenhouses, among geographical regions. It's really, it can be quite a web to untangle. And then we see them, poinsettias are ones that I think of for Pythium. Geraniums is another one that I think of for Pythium. And then we have a host of other bedding plants, including snapdragons that suffer from Pythium root rot. All right, Pythium root rot is a nibbler. It's a root nibbler. It doesn't come in for those big satisfying meals like Phytophthora can, but it will nibble until your root system really is negatively impacted. You often can see plant stunting. You can see delay in flowering. You can see just growth that you don't think is as vigorous as it should. And maybe you're blaming other cultural things. Maybe you think it's the maybe a soil pH, a different media type. Maybe you think it's a different fertilizer. Maybe you think it's the new grower that you have. And it could really be Pythium being the reason why your plants just aren't the way that you think they should be. So limiting Pythium, fungicide drenches are proven to help. Biocontrols really need to be used preventively before that root system encounters the inoculum. Often think about a transplanting stage. That's often when a plant like geraniums can encounter infested media. And so you need to have those biologicals introduced in the system ahead of time. Cultural controls are helpful, and they have to be part of the overall system. And then the fungus gnats and shore flies, as I've said before, really love our root rot organisms. Speaking of the biocontrols, I think Pythium is a really good example about how our oomycete fungicides really are so targeted to oomycetes. Our biological control active ingredients are not oomycete based, and so therefore I think you can combine strategies if you're so inclined to do so. All right, here's some of the testing. You know, we don't always have our untreated control plants outright die. Instead, they kind of languish. They don't grow vigorously. They don't flower when they should. Subdue Max, which is mefenoxam, metalaxyl is a similar material. It's really an old product. We do have resistant Pythium populations in some of our greenhouses that I will tell you have been in place for 30 years. And I know that because, you know, when I started my career, that was a big problem in some of these greenhouses. We test those populations periodically over the decades, and that resistant population is still there. And so I guess you just really don't want to create a resistant population in your greenhouse, because Subdue is a really lovely material, has a high level of efficacy, unless of course it's been overused and the Pythium has learned to live with it quite nicely. Terrazole is a really old product in the US. I think it's one that our EPA does not like, but it is one of the mainstays that we go to. And again, you know, I think Terrazole might be older than water. It's been around so long. Allude is a newer product. Its strength is Phytophthora. You can use it for Pythium. Over the years, we've seen it work relatively well. There are times when it doesn't work as well as Subdue or Terrazole or etradiazole. Segway is another product that we have looked at. It has reasonable control against Pythium. We don't see it shine in every single trial that we've run, but it's reasonably good, and it can be used in alternation so your Pythium populations don't develop resistance to metalaxyl mefenoxam. All right, you know, again, let's look at our biocontrol products. And again, this is across the board for all of our soil-borne pathogens. Remember, you don't really want to be in a high disease pressure situation. And so using sanitation, using media that drains well, adjusting your watering so the plants are not wet continuously, all of those sorts of growing methods will ensure that Pythium, for instance, will not get to a point where a biocontrol cannot be helpful, but the biocontrol has to be introduced prior to symptom development. It should be introduced at the beginning of your growing cycle and then reintroduced as needed. All right, an integrated program, that's really a message I want you to take away from this. We do talk a lot about fungicides, but we really need integration of cultural and other strategies for all of our soil-borne pathogens. Here's a nice study. We have 2 crops here. And so one crop on the left, one on the right. And so I think what's interesting here is that, some of these crops just seem to be more sensitive to Pythium. And so we looked at companion, soil guard, actinovate. These are all biological materials that are available in the US. And it's interesting to note that, for some of our crops, they work really, really well and are helpful against Pythium. And so if the disease pressure was lower, I think they would shine even more. Or if you wanted to use them in alternation with some of our traditional fungicides, I think that could be quite helpful as well. So we do look at these. We see differences in efficacy among our crops. And so that's something that we caution growers about. But again, if you could keep the disease pressure low, I think you would have more success. Here's Truban, that's the etradiazole. That's the really older product. Here's Root Shield. Here's a combination in the lower right-hand corner where we have Truban plus actinovate. And so I might say that the Truban plus actinovate looks better than the Truban by itself. And again, the Truban should have really no effect at all on the actinovate. And so combining them, could be a good strategy. All right, limit Pythium, just something to plant a seed here, if you will, about how cultivars can differ. And here we have snapdragon and geranium. And so here we have the Orbit Salmon Light, the Pinto Pink. We have the inoculated on the right, the non-inoculated on the left. This just, this Maverick White, I think, just doesn't have quite the integrity against Pythium that perhaps some of the others do, the Orbit Salmon Light. My message here is if you're growing different cultivars of a particular plant type and you see some not faring as well against root rot as others, then believe your observations, go with those observations, make some notes, and strive to include those cultivars as long as horticulturally they have the flower color, the size that you need. And you shouldn't doubt your observations, I guess, is my message here. Just know that there can be differences if you're really struggling with Pythium and you've tried a number of different things. Take notes about cultivars and see if you can work with one that is not quite as susceptible. All right, this is just a list. These cultivars change really rapidly, but this just is a list that we developed at that point in time using some of the cultivars that were available, where we actually saw significant differences between those that were least susceptible and those that were most susceptible. And then of course there were a bunch of cultivars in the middle that kind of were right in the middle of the continuum between least and most susceptible. All right, here's our Pythium A Team. In the US, we still have these very, very old products. They do have different modes of action, which is helpful. We do have some B Team products that I think are good enough, consistently enough to sandwich them between your A Team products. So you could lead off with an A Team product, go to segue, go back to an A Team product, and then come back to one of the B Team products. So I think there is some opportunity to utilize the materials going back and forth. The azoxystrobin, I feel like our results are really quite inconsistent and not terribly conclusive. And so that I might put that as a B- team, where Segway I think is more of a B to B+ product. We've used Allude as a drench, and in some cases it can be helpful, but we've seen some inconsistency there, so I would call that a B to a B- product. All right, wrapping up. Whoops, let's see. Wrapping up with our soil-borne pathogens. We are seeing some Fusarium. It is appearing more frequently. You really need a lab ID on this. It can mimic what other common root rots look like. It's difficult to manage. Fungicide drenches can help, but they're not a magic bullet. And then roguing disease plants is often really important. Some of the hosts that we are seeing, the Fusarium, carnation, chrysanthemum, cyclamen, ranunculus, begonia, aster, and lisianthus. We also have daylily pictured here. It's hard. Fusarium is difficult to manage. It's hard to salvage a crop that has a significant level of infection. We have a couple of products. The thiophanate methyl is an old one that is still used for Fusarium, fludeoxonil. We do have a newer active that has just come on the market, where I know on the vegetable side, they're having some pretty good results. But fungicides here, I think just are really a B team at best. I don't think we have any A team products. I think we have B products only. All right, so to wrap up, I know we want to have time for questions. Soil-borne pathogens and the root and crown rots that they result in rarely can really be site ID'd. Some examples might be Pythium on geranium. If you have a root rot on geranium, it's probably Pythium. If you have a root rot on poinsettia, it's probably Pythium. But some of our other vast array of crops can host really many of the pathogens that we talked about today. And so getting a diagnosis is important. It often means that you have to wait 10 to 14 days to know exactly what pathogen you're dealing with. However, you can work with a specialist to put together a broad spectrum program to try to limit the damage that you're seeing until you can then hone in on the specific pathogen causing the loss. And then once you know the pathogen, being enough of a geek, as I call it, to know how it spreads, how it got to you in the first place, how to make sure it doesn't revisit you. It's important to understand the biology enough to really be able to eliminate it from the system. All right, beyond fungicides, cultural practices are really important. We already talked about choosing a media that drains well. Watering is really important. And, so many, and we do this too, even on the research side, the new student in our lab is put on the watering detail, and that can be a real mistake. I often think of it as one of the most important jobs in the greenhouse. Training and supervising is time well spent. It will pay dividends. People, in my experience, tend to overwater more than underwater, and that leads to a host of issues that we have talked about. And then clean, sanitize, clean, sanitize, clean some more, sanitize some more. No one wants to hear that. It's not new technology. It's not catchy. It's tedious. It's dirty by nature, but it is so, so important to keeping these soil-borne pathogens limited in your growing system. Final words, more sanitation, scouting. We didn't spend too much time talking about this, but I'm sorry to say that our plant pathogens get moved around a lot. We're a very segmented industry. And so you may be getting your plugs in from one source or maybe two sources. You may be getting plugs in, you may be getting pre-finished material in, you may be getting rooted cuttings in. And all of these plant materials offer an opportunity for hitchhikers. I don't think it's a value add to get plugs that have Thielaviopsis that you didn't order. But we see so much of it. And so really inspecting incoming plant materials for anything that does not look right. And if something doesn't look right, say something right away. At least that's what I would do. Because once you have it in your system and you haven't been able to turn it around, now you've got a pathogen that can become resident in your greenhouse. And then it's hard to get, any compensation back because now it's been in your greenhouse for a month. So, for all that supplier knows that you introduced the problem from your greenhouse range. Cultural disease control, keep soil moisture consistent. Treat susceptible plants preventively with the most effective fungicides or biologicals, depending on what you prefer. And then just acknowledging kind of our local and our national resources for some of this information. And thanks for your attention. And that's what I have as my formal presentation. And I believe we have some time for questions.
Yeah, Mary, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I always learn something new every time talking to a plant pathologist, that's for sure. We have a couple questions in the chat, so I encourage anyone else who wants to ask a question to pop it in there or the Q&A, and I will get to it. I guess my first question was around black root rot, although this could apply to other root rots as well, is how often do you see resistance popping up in ornamentals? You gave some great program examples of your A team and your B team, and unfortunately we have a lot fewer chemicals than that, so our ability to rotate is limited. So if you had only 2 or 3 chemicals to rotate between, do you see a lot of resistance, or is it not as severe with some versus other root rots?
For the black root rot, we have not seen resistance develop. I mean, we do worry about that. And I have seen instances where, growers got infected plugs and they potted them. They were in their greenhouse for a period of time until it got sorted out. And now that pathogen does become a resident. And then in that case, we talk about really, really strict sanitation. We even talk about them growing a susceptible crop to Thielaviopsis in a different greenhouse. I mean, we're not rotating fields, but like, do you have to grow it in that range? We sanitized, we did everything we could, but, do you have to grow Pansy where you grew it last year, where you had Thielaviopsis? Can we grow it somewhere else? And then applying fungicides preventively from the beginning and doing that for Thielaviopsis on the susceptible crops for a couple of years until now we're going to see if we can get away from that and have we worked ourselves out of it. The Pythium and Phytophthora, they're like the famous ones, like they're famous in the ornamental systems are usually the first product resistance to. And that one example I gave you of Pythium is a crazy example, because we tested the populations in there, I mean, really like decades ago, literally decades ago. And every once in a while, the grower will say, well, can you come back? Can we take a look at it? We test it and it's still resistant. My grad student did a really nice study that's published in one of our journals. And she's very clever. She's really smart. She used really nice molecular tools to track populations. And at the end of it all, you know what her message is? That the populations are not changing from year to year, and that you have a resident population that you need to up your sanitation to get rid of. So we have all these really high-powered molecular tools. We're looking at the genetics. We're tracking them across crops in years. And what's the bottom line? You better clean up the system, because your Pythium is really happy hanging out in your greenhouse. And when you have that resident pathogen, as you continue to expose it to the same materials, cycle after cycle, year after year, that population becomes resistant. But sanitation, like for all of our fancy techniques, where are we back to? Cleaning.
That's a really fascinating message because as an entomologist, we often talk about resident populations and resistance with things like Western flower thrips. And I don't think I've ever heard that same
Oh, yeah.
analogy with resident populations of pathogens. So I think that's a great thing
Oh.
for growers to know is that they can, once they've found your farm, they might not want to leave your farm.
Yeah, we were expecting all these like really cool, like the population changes between, you know, poinsettias in the fall and geraniums in the spring, or if you get an influx in from the materials that you're buying in, how does that change? We're gonna have all these really cool things. And at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, clean up, folks.
I mean, I feel bad for her project because you always want to find exciting things, but at least that's a good straightforward message for the growers.
Yeah, she also has a lot of information in there about how we sampled for resistance to that particular fungicide. So, but the Pythiums and Phytophthora for sure, those are ones to be really on guard. We have so many examples in so many systems that it's going to happen. It's a matter of when.
So sort of going along with that, you talk about sanitation, especially if you've got resident populations. How important is water treatment in all of this, especially if you've got a closed or circulating system, especially with things like Pythium that have swimming spores?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in some of our greenhouses, they have an ebb and flood sort of system. And, you know, it's a closed system. And people do different treatments. Treatment's really important. Phytophthora and some Pythiums, you know, have a swimming spore. And so that swimming spore is going to be activated during that watering system. And there was another really neat study that our lab did a number of years ago. And again, you use these really high-powered tools to like kind of come up with what we probably thought would happen anyway. And so there were all these different crops growing on the ebb and flood floor. And what he was able to show is that the Phytophthora infecting those multiple crops all had the same genetic footprint, which basically meant it was spreading very readily within that system, that it's not that, you know, it was a different Phytophthora, or the African violet came in with one Phytophthora. It didn't get it from its neighbor, you know, way across that greenhouse range. So it was a really good example of how those ebb and flood floors really are very good at spreading that pathogen. And so then there are sanitizers and other elements that can be used in those water systems, and they should and could be used. And then in any kind of system where like if it's a pit style system or water retention, what will happen, of course, over time is at the bottom, you'll accumulate a lot of organic material, and those should be cleaned out. If that's how you're looking at it, those should be cleaned out really frequently, or as much as you're able to.
Great. And someone was asking if you knew anything about root rots in peonies specifically. Do you know what they're susceptible to and what good strategies are in that crop?
You know, I do not. I love peonies. I have them in my gardens. You know, I don't know what is most common there. In that case, I think it would really be worth working with a diagnostic clinic to get that figured out. My guess is it could be a couple of them. It could be both an oomycete, like a Phytophthora, and a true fungi. Jeremy, I don't know if you've come across anything in peonies that you can, if you've put, you know, submitted samples.
No, Jan would probably be the best person to ask for that one.
Yeah, in that case, you know, one might be well served to put an oomycete product with a true fungi product. So the Thielaviopsis and Rhizoctonia materials would represent those products that would impact a true fungi. And then the oomycete, the Pythium Phytophthora materials. And those tank mixes can work, especially while you're waiting for diagnostics. But the diagnostics allow you to really pinpoint and go in with a more highly effective program where you're not applying chemicals that aren't needed and aren't helpful. So I really think that that's probably the best approach.
Excellent. So along the lines of that, of combining products, I was thinking of a question around using biocontrols. A lot of growers here, one strategy that they use is to use a chemical fungicide to sort of knock things back or preventatively at the beginning, and then wait a week or two and then apply their biofungicides. Do you think that's a good strategy, or do you have a different recommendation?
Well, so for our conventional fungicides, I always think about how long they're going to be active. So I don't think of them as like a contact while they knocked it out and cleansed the palate, if you will. And now we're going to introduce, a biological into the vacuum that's been created. Like, I don't think of it like that. I think of it as most of our conventional products, I think, would have an efficacy duration of about 21 days. The label sometimes will say 30 days. In our root rot trials, we'll start to see control fade after 21 days. And so I think of that fungicide is doing its job. It's holding things back. It's creating a safe zone for the roots to flourish. And that lasts for about 21 days. And then after 21 days, the pathogen is able to, do its thing again, kind of ramp back up. That's why you see reapplication intervals, like on our conventional products, right? You have to have a reapplication interval. It's not like one and done. I think what they're doing is just fine. If they want to use, conventional material, follow in a week later with a biological. If they're really keeping things, and maybe that's at transplanting. At transplanting, we think there's an opportunity for pathogens to be introduced into that growing system, into that, that plug or that pre-finished plant. So that's why a lot of drenches are around that transplanting time. And so if they want to do a conventional product then, and then follow it up with a biological control, I think that's fine. If they're keeping things really clean, they don't have a history of disease, that might be enough to get them to the finish line. If they have disease pressure, they're starting to see plant growth that's variable, like it's a little bit like a roller coaster. Root rots are almost always the cause for that because they're affecting some plants more than others. So you see this variation in plant size.
Okay, great. And my last question, and then we'll see if Siobhan has any questions that she's thought of. You mentioned varieties can be really important in the susceptibility of plants to different root rots. You mentioned you've got some trials where you've got that information. What's another good place for growers to go for that information? Do breeders have that kind of information, or is it just like it's either been tested by a pathologist or it's not, or we don't know?
No. Yeah. So the horticulture industry, we're such finicky consumers, and I'm a consumer. I'm a big gardener. I need an intervention for sure. So we're, but I'm also old enough to be a bit old fashioned. So I don't really crave the newest, latest, whatever, but a lot of people do. Right. And so the breeders are always pushing that envelope, right? New cultivars, new something, to catch people's eye. And so the cultivar turnover, I think, is so much that I think, although the work that we did is, I don't think it might be 4 to 5 years old. I'm hesitant to say if those cultivars are still available because I don't know. And so breeders it's different than like on the vegetable side, where those cultivars just don't change that quickly. I mean, they do change. But boy, I think on the floriculture side, it moves really fast. And then some people just don't quite, I don't want to say they don't believe that cultivars differ, but it's not something that they would pursue. So my grad student worked on the Pythium side, and then they did some work with botrytis susceptibility, and people kind of poo-pooed that, like, why would you do that? I'm like, well, because
I've seen it myself with black root rot and calibrachoa and different colors of the different rots acting differently.
So and that's why I say, for growers, there really isn't someone out there doing the work routinely, and so I just think they should believe what they see.
Yeah, be their own detective. I think that's a great.
Yeah, and if they just have a place where they can make those notes, so another year when they're looking at what to order, like that one cultivar just never really took off compared to the other one. Could be a number of things, but why not make that observation and try to layer into that integrated program, so there's not so much pressure on a biological, there's not so much pressure on a chemical control. Like, let's bring all the tools that we could possibly use.
Yeah, that's a great message. Siobhan or Jeremy, do you have any follow-up questions?
No, I just I wanted to say thanks so much for talking about the water treatment, Mary. I think that's really important for our growers, and just talking about using those cultural controls, not reusing pots, looking at the sanitation. I think it's a yearly issue, and we just need to take your advice and keep going with that. So thank you.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much. It's nice to see all of you. Maybe one day we'll even be in person.
Yeah, I hope so. Then maybe at the next Canadian Greenhouse Conference. And with that, I would just like to thank you and let all our participants know that this talk will be available on our On Floriculture YouTube channel afterwards. And you can also go to our On Floriculture blog and subscribe, so that way you'll know about any of our upcoming webinars. And with that, everyone, just have a great day.
All right, thank
Thanks.
you. All
Thank
right,
you.
bye-bye.
Bye.